I, a 31-year-old female, find myself at a loss for how to articulate my experience. The mere thought of it still leaves me feeling somewhat disoriented. Prior to my hospitalization, I began to feel increasingly fatigued and developed a persistent fever. The doctors diagnosed me with an infection and advised that I remain in the hospital for a period of time. Although I was frightened, I expected my husband to support me during this challenging time. Initially, he visited a few times, but his visits were brief, and he appeared more impatient than concerned. I should have recognized that something was amiss at that moment, as I could sense his irritation whenever a nurse or doctor posed questions in his presence. It seemed as though my illness was a personal affront to him. Eventually, he ceased visiting altogether. I attempted to reach out through calls and texts, but he always had an excuse for his absence. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, I was extremely weak, struggling to move with a bag of medications in hand. I anticipated that he would at least be there to pick me up or assist me into the car, but he was nowhere to be found. I had to call my mother to take me home. Upon arriving, the house was eerily quiet. I initially thought he might be out running errands, but then I noticed that his suitcase was missing, along with several of his favorite clothes from the closet. A note I discovered on the kitchen counter read, "Don't call me until you're ready to step up," which made no sense, as I had just been discharged from the hospital. Shortly thereafter, I received a text message stating, "Your damaged goods." At that moment, I felt my legs give way, and I collapsed onto the couch, staring at my phone in utter disbelief. I was unsure whether to cry, scream, or break something. Instead, I decided to call my uncle, a straightforward individual who does not shy away from confronting difficult situations. Handle drama. When I told him what was going on, he went quiet for a second, then said, "Don't panic. Don't do anything. You'll regret. We'll figure this out." He told me to keep my doors locked, check if anything else was missing, and document everything. My mind was spinning, but I managed to follow his advice. Later that night, I found out my husband was off on some beach vacation with a co-worker because a mutual friend stumbled on her pictures and sent them to me. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I was fresh out of the hospital, and there he was posting goofy selfies at a resort looking back. I can see a million red flags. My husband was always. This charming social guy who knew how to turn on the charisma when we first met. I thought he was refreshing. He had a way of making people laugh at parties over time. Though the shine wore off, he gets sarcastic. When I disagree with him, say snarky things about my clothes or my weight, then act like it was just a joke. My friends hinted he might be controlling, but I figured I was just being overly sensitive. His mum didn't help matters. My mother-in-law had it out for me from day one. Everything I did was wrong. My cooking, my clothes, my way of talking. She'd compare me to other women in the family, always implying I fell short. My father-in-law was usually quieter, but he had this knack for dropping passive-aggressive comments, reminding me that I was lucky to marry into their family. My sister-in-law would show up randomly, pretending to be supportive, but really she was just digging for dirt to report back to her mum. I put up with it for years, hoping they'd warm up to me. It never got better when my health took a turn. My husband acted like I'd done it on purpose to inconvenience him. Suddenly, he was too busy to visit. Is it too stress a call? And by the time I was discharged, he bailed on me completely. The whole house felt haunted that first day back. I just stared at empty drawers thinking, is this really happening? Then there was that text, the one that spelled out exactly how he saw me. Part of me wanted to curl up an SOB, but another part of me felt this weird numbness. My uncle arrived the next morning. Furious on my behalf, he gave me a hug, then started making a plan. See a lawyer, save all texts, block any harassment. He wasn't about to let me get bulldozed by my husband or his parents. I felt so relieved knowing someone would stand up for me, especially since my own parents, though supportive, were worried sick about my health and didn't want to overload me with more stress. My uncle took it upon himself to be my shield. That shield got tested almost immediately. My mother-in-law showed up the following day, barging in without knocking. She started yelling that I'd failed her son, accusing me of making a big deal out of my hospital stay, calling me weak. I just stood there stunned and still not fully recovered. She said he deserves better than a woman who can't keep herself together, or something along those lines. Then my uncle stepped out of the guest room, told her she was trespassing and that he'd call the police if she didn't leave. She stomped off, throwing insults over her shoulder. The second she was gone, I pretty much collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed. After that, I got a stream of texts and calls from my husband's side of the family. Some insisted I fixed my marriage because I was breaking his heart by not being more supportive. Others basically told me to get out of the house, or if I couldn't handle him. It was unreal. Blocked most of them, but they kept trying new numbers. My father was livid when he found out, and together with my uncle, they started really prepping for the worst-case scenarios, like if my husband tried to claim I was mentally unfit or some nonsense. Like that. The craziest part was that my husband himself was radio silent until about a week after I got home. That's when he showed up on my doorstep, looking like he'd slept in his car. He mumbled something about missing me, that the co-worker vacation didn't go as planned, that he regretted the harsh words he used. He acted like calling me damaged goods was just a slip of the tongue. He even tried the whole watery eyes routine, saying he realized how much he loved me. My uncle was watching from the hallway, arms crossed. I asked my husband straight up if he was back because he suddenly cared about me, or because his fling had ended and he needed a backup plan. He gave this lame excuse about being confused and overwhelmed. Then he said we should just pretend nothing happened. That's when I put my foot down. I told him we were done and that I wanted him out of my life. He looked genuinely shocked. I think he'd expected me to cry and beg him to stay right on cue. His mother and father suddenly showed up at my door. They started lecturing me, saying, "A real wife stance by her husband." My mother-in-law said something like, "Men have needs, and if you can't meet them, what do you expect?" My father-in-law warned me about ruining the family name. I told them to leave and they refused. So my uncle threatened to call the cops again. That did the trick. They stormed off in a rage. I was shaking from all the adrenaline, but at the same time, I felt a bit empowered for the first time in ages. Of course, that didn't mean it was over. I kept getting messages from my sister-in-law saying I was dramatic and destroying her brother. My uncle, seeing how stressed I was, encouraged me to all communication should be blocked, allowing him to manage any direct interactions. During this time, I was attempting to recover physically, but the stress was overwhelming, making it difficult for me to sleep. My father introduced me to an old acquaintance, a private investigator, who uncovered that my husband had been sending flirtatious messages and inappropriate photos to multiple women at his workplace using his company phone, which constituted a significant policy violation. If this information were to become public, he would face serious consequences. We decided not to disclose this information immediately, keeping it as leverage in case he or his family attempted to manipulate the situation, such as lying in court or claiming I was at fault. Predictably, they resorted to further tactics. A few days later, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law knocked forcefully on my door, insisting that I cease this nonsense and allow my husband to return home. I contacted the police, who instructed them to leave me alone. They complied, albeit while shouting accusations about my actions tearing their family apart. That evening, my husband called, furious that I had involved the police with his mother, claiming I was out of control. I informed him that if she continued to harass me, I would not hesitate to involve the authorities again. He threatened me, stating I would regret my actions. My uncle promptly texted him, warning that if the harassment persisted, we would disclose what we knew about his misconduct at work. This seemed to silence him for a couple of days, after which he called me back, feigning calmness and questioning why I was jeopardizing his career. I replied that if he and his family ceased their harassment, his secret would remain safe. Otherwise, it would be their issue. He muttered something before hanging up, and shortly thereafter, I received a letter from his father's attorney, demanding I let them access their property like my house was somehow theirs. It was ridiculous. My name's on the place, and they never paid a dime toward it. We set up a meeting at my lawyer's office. My husband came with his mother and father, all of them looking smug, like they thought they could intimidate me face to face. The second we sat down, my mother-in-law went off about how grateful I was. My father-in-law demanded compensation for the stress I supposedly caused his son, my husband. Mostly sat there looking uncomfortable, my lawyer listened politely, then slid a folder across the table with all the evidence of my husband's workplace violations. Text dates, logs, everything. My father-in-law went pale, and my mother-in-law looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. My husband just stared at the folder, speechless. I told them plainly that if they tried to drag me into any more legal nonsense or harass me, I'd use all of it in court. I wasn't threatening them. I was just making it clear I had every right to defend myself if they claimed I was the bad guy. My mother-in-law yelled that I was blackmailing them, and my lawyer explained very calmly that we were simply prepared to present evidence. If they pursued a fight, they had no real argument left. So my father-in-law grumbled that maybe we should settle everything quietly. My husband mumbled he hadn't wanted a fight in the first place, which was a joke, but whatever. We ended up agreeing that I'd file for divorce and they'd stop trying to threaten me or stake any claim on my house after that meeting. They finally backed off. My sister-in-law tried sending me one last email about how I was cruel and should let my husband fix his one mistake, but I blocked her again. My father-in-law and mother-in-law went radio silent. My husband cooperated with the divorce, probably too scared I'd hand over the phone records to his employer. I heard through the grapevine that the co-worker wanted nothing more to do with him, so he was on his own. The phone calls died down, and I started feeling like maybe I could breathe again. I was still dealing with leftover exhaustion from my hospital stay, but at least I could focus on my own recovery. Without constant harassment, my uncle would swing by to check on me, or even sleep over in the guest room so I wouldn't feel unsafe. My mum dropped off meals to make sure I was eating. My dad handled a lot of the paperwork alongside our lawyer. Emotionally, it was still a roller coaster. One moment, I'd feel relieved and strong the next. I'd be sad that my marriage had disintegrated in such a brutal way. But as the days passed, I realized this was better than staying with someone who is worthless. Whenever I wasn't perfect, I also realized how toxic his entire family was, and I felt kind of dumb for not seeing it sooner. A couple weeks later, I bumped into my husband at a grocery store. He looked like he wanted to talk, but I just walked away with my cart. That same day, a mutual friend told me he was telling people I was unstable and had kicked him out for no reason. It stung a bit, but at the end of the day, I knew the truth, and so did everyone who mattered. My uncle told me not to waste energy trying to correct him. He'd dig his own hole if he kept lying. Now that some time has passed, I'm feeling a lot stronger. My health is way better, and I don't have to tiptoe around his family or brace for more random visits. The divorce is in motion, and there shouldn't be any big hurdles since we had no kids, and I'm keeping my home. I redecorated a bit, tossed out anything that reminded me of him. And it feels good to reclaim my space. I've started reconnecting with friends and picking up hobbies I neglected for a while. It's nice not having to worry about whether my husband will approve or roll his eyes. I'm sharing this because maybe someone else out there is dealing with a partner who doesn't support them. Or, worse, who bails when they're most vulnerable. Please know you do have options. You can reach out to family, friends, lawyers, whoever. One should not feel compelled to accept such treatment. It is astonishing how quickly circumstances can change. However, it is equally remarkable to discover the support available when one finally reaches out for help. My uncle, in particular, proved to be an invaluable source of assistance. While I cannot predict what the future holds, I am certain that I no longer need to tread carefully. I refuse to be a prisoner to my husband's sense of entitlement or the bullying from his family. At times, leaving a toxic environment is the only viable path forward, even if it feels daunting at the time. After enduring the pain of being labelled as damaged goods immediately after my hospitalization, I am grateful that I took that courageous step. Although I may have lost a marriage, I regained my self-respect, and I would choose that over remaining trapped with someone who never truly cared for me. This is the narrative of my journey from being hospitalized and hopeful to becoming separated and free. It has been a challenging experience, but I can now assert that I will no longer allow him or his family to dictate my worth. I recognize my value, and I finally believe it for myself. while I still have a journey ahead to achieve complete emotional and physical healing. Each day reinforces my conviction that I made the right decision. I hope that anyone who reads this and sees reflections of their own life understands they are not alone and that it is entirely possible to stand up and escape before situations worsen. It is not an ease.